Let's testify tonight. Oh God, you've done so much for me. I'm grateful and overwhelmed here at your feet. And I could stay here forever, Lord. But you call me to something more. And I hear you say that you have a plan to use every broken woman and man to display just how good you are. We are your living pieces of art. What good does it do to hide away when all of my scars are a picture of grace? All right. So I will testify of the power of God. I will tell the word of the hope I have found. You, Lord. For my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Oh, do you believe it? Has He done it for anyone else? I said, has He done it for anyone else? Because the God that I serve, He's always at work. Has He done it for anyone else? So come on and testify of the power of God. Come on and tell the world of the hope we have found. For our body was broken, our hearts were made whole, and that's too good to keep to yourself. Come on and testify of the power of God. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. I'm gonna testify. Somebody testify your voice. This is my. So I'm gonna testify. Somebody testify. Come on, take it up. Jesus, my champion, the victor of grace, the only one worthy of all of my praise. Yeah. So come on and testify. Oh, somebody lift Him high. Come on, testify the power of God. I will tell the world of the hope I have found. Oh, for my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Sing that. Oh, my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Oh, let's do that right now, Murfreesboro.
And hey guys, hope you're doing well tonight. I am exhausted, I'm not gonna lie. I'm running on about 2.5 hours of sleep, so it's kind of a long story. But yesterday evening, I had something very important I had to do. That hopefully, if something becomes of it, I'll be able to tell you about in the not too distant future. But had to get it done yesterday. And so I didn't get that done until I think roughly 2, maybe 2:30 in the morning. And so then went to bed, had to get up at 3:30 in the morning because my daughter had to take her to work at 4 in the morning. So then I came back home, got home, I don't know, around 4:30 ish or so. Got back to bed by around 5 ish. Had to get up at about 6:30 ish because had to take the wife's dog into the vet for an appointment. So yeah. And then after the dog vet appointment thing, went back home brought the dog home, and then I had an appointment with Pastor Josh from the Experience Community out in Woodbury. I meet with him every once in a while, and so that's like about an almost an hour drive. So that appointment was at 11:30, so I had to leave for that at about 10:30. I got back into town about 2 in the afternoon. I drove Uber for a couple hours, and here I am. So yeah, that's my day in a nutshell. So not that anybody asked, but in case you cared. Anyway, sorry. I know I meant to start a few minutes earlier and I didn't, but that was just me sitting here at the computer screen staring and not realizing that the time had ticked by. So that's just how punchy I am right now. Arabic, first of the house, good to see you, buddy. Trek Reviewer is also here, unusually early today. Multi Gunman also here. What is up with you guys being punctual today? It's not a full moon, is it? And Bradley also in the house, who's usually first, but now is relegated to being fourth. So Bradley, buddy, you're going to have to work on that. Now, granted, Arabic and Track Review are posted before I even started, but, it still counts. And there's Robert saying shalom tonight. Shalom, shalom, Robert. Hope you are doing well. And so today we're going to be covering Leviticus chapter 20. So we've been, last few chapters of Leviticus, we've been going over various sins, from and not necessarily. Well, some of them are various laws, I guess we should say, and regulations. So the regulations are things like, well, how do you deal with an infectious disease? When we talk of laws, that's more of sin issues, like when we talk about the forbidden sexual practices and stuff like that. So today, however, we're going to and Sign Book Collector says, sorry, I haven't been here to be. Hey, you know what, Sign Book Collector? I'm just glad you're here now, buddy. And you know what? We do not take roles. So I don't begrudge anybody not being here, but I'm always happy when they are here. So also, lack of sleep is a cause of multiplier of health issues, right? But you really should try your best to get the sleep you need. Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. It's just yesterday was just a cosmic cluster F of circumstances that made it so that sleep was impossible. I will sleep like the proverbial rock tonight. And Trek Viewers also been under the weather for the last few days. Sorry to hear that. I know how that feels for sure. And so, let me turn this off so it's not annoying everybody. That's a little space heater that I have, trying to keep it warm enough for T'Pring, who's sitting right here as usual. And if you notice, I know I'm sitting in kind of a weird position, so I keep having to look up to see the camera because I'm a little closer to the camera than I usually am, and that's because I have right now it's a belt on that has the charger for my neural stimulator because the battery ran down, and so I'm trying to get it recharged so that I can use it. It'll help me sleep better tonight. And yes, sleep data, sleep. Little best of both worlds action going on. So, without further ado, what I don't know if I said this before. What I'm trying to remember. Ado is like a term that means. I mean, I know there's like much ado about nothing, but let's see. Ado is a state of agitation or fuss, especially about something unimportant. Okay. But that's funny because when they say without further ado, I wasn't really agitated or fussy, was I? I'm sure Darren would say I was, but anyway, let's switch screens before I get in trouble for mentioning the D word. All right, and hey, Tristan, good to see you, buddy. And let's get this up here. So today we're going to be going over punishments for various sins. So Leviticus chapter 20, and we'll get right into it here. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Molech is to be put to death." So, uh, just to make it clear, child sacrifice. Oh, wait a minute. I think we already did this one, didn't we? Yeah, we did. Oh, no, we haven't. Okay, wait. Let me double check because I had it listed that the last one we did was 19. Okay, yeah, it was 19. Man, I am definitely a little punchy today. All right. Um, despite what some people say about Abraham and his son Isaac and God telling him to sacrifice Isaac, God does not want child sacrifice, not in the sense of actually being willing to slaughter your own child, for good crops or for favors from God or anything like that. But it was a common practice among the Canaanites. And keep in mind that when they're moved, the promised land, you keep hearing it referred to as the promised land, but the promised land is really the land of Canaan. And the only people that, of all the people that the Israelites fought, I think the only ones that are still around today are the Palestinians, which, gee, that fight's obviously settled right down. Anyway, so also do notice that, and this is another thing that for the most part, at least mostly, is something that continues to this day as far as the basis of American law, which is that most of these laws apply not just to the Jews, but to resident aliens. So anybody who is living amongst them. And likewise, when you look at the laws of the United States, the laws as well as the rights of Americans, a lot of people think that rights are only for citizens. But, then I guess those people didn't read the Declaration of Independence, even though it's in the Trump edition of the Bible, which says that God gave all men certain inalienable rights. So if they are inalienable rights, that means that you have them regardless of your citizenship status. But yeah, no, I won't get into that. So anyway, but the main thing here is that a lot of these laws and punishments apply not just to the Jews but to anybody living in the land. Okay, where was it? I myself. Oh, wait, let's see. Let's just start that over. So say to the Israelites, any Israelite or foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Moloch is to be put to death. The members of the community are to stone him. So specifically, stone to death. I myself will set my face against him and will cut him off from his people. For by sacrificing his children to Moloch, he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. If the members of the community close their eyes when that man sacrifices one of his children to Moloch and they fail to put him to death, I myself will set my face against him and his family and will cut them off from their people, together with all who follow him in prostituting themselves to Moloch. Now, this is kind of interesting because this is God basically saying that, okay, this person commits a crime and that person is to be stoned to death. And then God says further, he will cut him off from his people because of the fact that they profane the name of God. But if the members of the community close their eyes, in other words, or like in the modern vernacular, if you turn a blind eye to it, if you don't do anything about it, if you simply say, whatever, it's no big deal, then you are to be cut off as well. So, in other words, I'm sorry to the people that say snitches get stitches, but the simple fact is that you are not to ignore people doing that kind of thing. Now, do keep in mind that there's a little bit of context to be taking into it, particularly as Christians, that this is only applying in the modern vernacular as a Christian to other Christians. So when it comes to someone who is a Christian, if they are behaving in a wantonly sinful manner and we don't call them out on it, we are guilty of that sin along with them. So what we are called to do is to confront that person. Now, obviously, in the modern vernacular, we don't stone people to death because we do not live in a theocracy. And so, it's just not a thing anymore. But yeah. And I am definitely not an expert on since someone asked about Arabic asked who is Moloch. But Moloch is simply, in fact, it's kind of funny. If you look up Moloch, it'll simply say it's a Canaanite deity associated with child sacrifice. And the identity Moloch is not the important thing. And that this is another thing we got to be too careful about, ironically, being too legalistic when talking about the law. And this is one of the big things that Christ kept trying to drive into people is that it's not about as much about the letter of the law as the spirit of the law. It's not about, this is not saying, oh, by the way, sacrificing to Moloch is bad, but if you sacrifice to Baal, it's okay. That's we got to be very, very careful about that. Child sacrifice, bad. And if you do it, you are yourself it is a capital punishment. And you and anybody else that is guilty of this will be cut off by God himself. And that is definitely not a place you want to be. I will set my face against anyone who turns to mediums and spiritists to prostitute themselves by following them, and I will cut them off from their people. Now, what's interesting is we will see later in the Old Testament an example of someone consulting a medium, and it's something that you are called specifically not to do. Consecrate yourselves and be holy. Remember, we talked about this. Holy means set apart. because I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and follow them. We've heard that before. I am the Lord who makes you holy, who makes you set apart. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. Because they have cursed their father or mother, their blood will be on their own head. Now, again, this is one of those things that cursing doesn't mean saying a bad word, right? That's kind of in the modern vernacular when we say, somebody cursed, we usually means they might have said the F word or, or something like that. That's not what the biblical definition of a curse is. The biblical definition of a curse is to literally call evil upon another person. To literally want the harm of another individual is to curse them. Now, in the modern vernacular, yeah, if you say F you, you are probably wishing harm on somebody. But it's not the use of the word itself. It's not harsh language that is the reason that it is a curse. It is the intended use of that harsh language. The interesting thing is, many people that we would consider saints, including Jesus himself, occasionally used harsh language. It just doesn't sound like harsh language because we read the nice translated versions of these. But if you think about the idea that, for example, I can't remember exactly where it is. I apologize, but where somebody compares the faith of a righteous man to filthy rags, that just sounds like, oh, okay, so, dirty cloth or something. But they don't know what filthy rags actually means in the vernacular. And it is definitely something that you don't want to be compared to. And it's basically rags that a woman who is on her monthly cycle would be sitting upon. So that's definitely not something that is pleasant language. We also have the idea, Jesus compared the Pharisees to whitewashed tombs. A very, in modern vernacular means nothing, but he's basically talking about the fact that they're complete and utter hypocrites, that they look all nice and clean on the outside, but inside, he literally says this. Jesus has a tendency to explain a lot of what he says, that on the outside they're nice and clean, but on the inside there's rotting flesh. So, this is harsh language. It's just not modern curse words. But then again, modern curse words didn't exist 2,000 years ago. And And so that's interesting. So thank you for looking it up, I guess, on Wikipedia. I don't know if it's 100% true, but for those of you that might not be looking at the chat, that the name Moloch has been understood to refer to a Canaanite god. However, since 1935, scholars have speculated that Moloch refers to the sacrifice itself, since the Hebrew word I assume that's Moloch, is identical in spelling to the term that means sacrifice in the closely related Punic language. I did not know that. The second position has grown increasingly popular, but it remains contested. So, and I could see why there's a certain logic to that. And the weird thing though is that, okay, so if the term Moloch means sacrifice, let's take a look. Since we have it handy dandy available right here, let's turn on our Greek and Hebrew while we got it right here and see, because the interesting thing about that passage is like, so right here, Moloch, right? But also we have the word sacrifice, which is Natan, a different word. So if we look at the word Natan, let's see, as to give, put, to be given, dedicated, to be given to be given. Okay, so that's interesting because it doesn't, Natan does not necessarily mean sacrifice. Now, Moloch, painful god, shameful king. Let's see, what's this? Min is marker, source, extension from source, hidden, let's see, children, seed, semen. That's funny. Propagating species, also child, offspring. That makes sense. So it is kind of interesting that the term that is translated to sacrifice, its primary definition is not necessarily sacrifice as much as it looks like it's a term that means a type of looking at the various words used for it would be something that is committed to something. Like notice it has to give in marriage is mentioned a couple of times here, to appoint, to place, to deliver. So are all translated to sacrifice. So I think that I think that Jeffrey may have a really good point there. So, but unfortunately, we don't know with 100% certainty, except to say that, what we tend to do is we try to get the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. And I think it's pretty clear that child sacrifice is the prohibition here, not specifically the child sacrifice to a specific God. So, in that respect, I would tend to agree with what the Wikipedia writer said. Whether or not that's the literal meaning or not, I do not know, but I'm certainly no expert on Hebrew and do not claim to be. All right, so back to it. That's actually, thank you for the little diversion there, Jeffrey. I do appreciate it. All right, I already read that part. Okay, so yeah, cursing your mother and father, we talked about what a curse is. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. This is an interesting stuff we're going to get into right here. But so if you commit adultery with another man's wife, you and the woman are to be put to death. All right, got it so far? If a man has sexual relations with his father's wife, he has dishonored his father. Both the man and the woman are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man has sexual relations with his daughter-in-law, both of them are to be put to death. What they have done is a perversion. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, here's one of those very controversial verses. Both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. And again, I know that some people don't like the fact that that's in there, but I didn't write the book. But notice, and this is kind of what I find interesting about these various illegal sexual relations, is that the first one listed, so the primary prohibition here is adultery, meaning heterosexual sex between a man and a woman when one or the other is married, right? That is adultery. Not to be confused with fornication, which is if they are unmarried. But the the funny thing is that you have all these Christian groups that fight tooth and nail over Leviticus 2013 about the fact that it's that the homosexuals are homosexual sex. Remember, notice it doesn't say if a person is attracted to a person of the same gender. It says if they actually have sexual relations. Just like if, none of these things, like if a man is attracted to his neighbor's wife, that's not a crime, right? But if they have sexual relations, it is, right? If a man is attracted to other men, that's not a crime. It is, however, in the theocratic sense, if they actually commit the act. But it's not even listed as the primary one here. Not to say that it's not a sin, but only to say that many Christians tend to ignore verse 10 while going completely ape crap over verse 13. And I'm sorry, but, they're pretty much at the same level. If a man marries both a woman and her mother, it is wicked. Both he and they must be burned in the fire, so that no wickedness is to be among you. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he is to be put to death, and you must kill the animal. If a woman approaches an animal to have sexual relations with it, kill both the woman and the animal. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man marries his sister, the daughter of either his father or his mother, and they have sexual relations, it is a disgrace. Boy, this is sounding awfully similar to a previous chapter. Oh, and I saw Stan was asking what it was by accident, and you were only 16. If what was by accident that you had sex, you don't accidentally whoopsie have sex. Um, Anyway, if a man marries his sister, his daughter, either his father or his mother, they have sexual relations. This is a disgrace. Notice, however, they are to be publicly removed from their people. He has dishonored his sister and will be held responsible. So, under this particular thing, if a man marries his sister, while it is considered disgraceful, it is not capital punishment. If a man has sexual relations with a woman during her monthly period, he is exposed to the source of the flow, and she has also uncovered it. Both of them are to be cut off from their people. Again, not a capital offense. Do not have sexual relations with the sister of either your mother or your father. This would dishonor your close relative. Both of you would be held responsible. Notice we've gone down a step in the punishment phase here. If a man has sexual relations with his aunt, he has dishonored his uncle. They will be held responsible. They will die childless. So notice they're not to be executed, but it's saying that God is not going to allow them to have children. And so let's see. And yeah, I know this. It's funny because there are several of these that are obviously repeated, and why is this repeated from earlier chapters when we were talking about the whole section on sexual practices? I do not know. I didn't write the book. That'd be a good question for God, though. Maybe because, I mean, this is all speculation here, but it does make sense that sexual immorality is such a pervasive form of sin that it bears repeating a lot of this because people don't take it seriously. To this day, think about it. Today, in 21st century America, do we take any of this really all that seriously except for maybe having sex with a close blood relative? And even that, by the way, like as close as first cousins is perfectly legal in most states in the United States, So even that's not really looked at all that harshly. And but pretty much almost everything else here. I mean, yeah, bestiality is kind of weird, and kind of you might go, ew, gross. But there are also a lot of people that say, hey, as long as the animal's not being harmed, you know, and there are people that genuinely feel that way. That's where society is, and so and this is the stuff that's repeated in the Bible. If a man marries his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has thus dishonored his brother. They will be childless. Again, these are basically like consequences that do not involve capital punishment here, and some of these consequences aren't even put on by man at all. And of course, this is also why some people will laugh at much of what's in the Bible, because they'll say, well, wait a minute. Where is the evidence that if you marry your brother's wife, you will not have children? Because, it happens, I don't think all the time, but I'm sure it does happen. However, this is also specifically these punishments are specifically for Israel, and some people would argue specifically during the pre-Christian era, because remember, Christ has fulfilled the law. And so that means that, saying that, oh, well, wait a minute, that's not happening anymore. Well, that's because we are in a post Christ era. Keep all my decrees and laws and follow them, so that the land where I'm bringing you to live may not vomit you out. You must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive you out before you, because they all did these things. I abhor them. But I said to you, you will possess the land. I give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has set you apart from the nations. Notice before it said holy, now it's actually spelling it out, who has set you apart. One other thing about this particular section, and this is one of those things for those biblical literalists out there that want to try to argue that everything in the Bible is 100% literal all the time. Then show me any place on planet Earth where there are rivers of milk and honey, because that would be an awfully unsanitary place. So obviously this is not meant to be taken as a literal description of the land of Canaan. And there are people, I've heard some interesting ideas about it, that, for example, milk and honey could be an argument that this is a very agriculturally rich area, because milk is often associated with milking animals such as cattle and goats, and honey is often associated with horticulture, because you need bees to properly get the plants reproducing. So the milk and honey could mean something like that, or it could just mean a place of great abundance. So it doesn't really matter as far, people get worked up over some of the semantics on this, but really the point is that he's taking him to a better place. And that we need to not get hung up on things that it's kind of funny, because this is something I was talking to Josh about when I was talking to him today, is like some things in the Bible I think are clearly allegorical, but allegory is also always referring. This is what allegory is, and one of the reasons I was talking to Josh about, Josh has a degree in English, and he actually has a master's level English education. And when you talk about allegory, you are still talking about literal things. An allegory is a picturesque description of a literal thing. And so for example, and I used this when I was having the conversation with him, at the very beginning of Genesis, it says that, what's the first thing that God does in the description after, well, it says he created the heavens and the earth, but then the first thing he does when it starts breaking it down is God said, let there be light. So if we are to take this at an absolute literal perspective, God saying it would mean that God had to have lips, a tongue, vocal cords, lungs, air, and all that in order to literally speak the words, let there be light. So when God says when Genesis says God said, which he says that many times in the first couple chapters of Genesis, it doesn't mean that God talked in the same way that we do. Now, there are other times, and this is where Josh and I, poked back at me a little bit, but it was a good conversation, is, well, what about when it says that, for example, God spoke to Moses through the burning bush when we were in Exodus? And I said, well, that's different because that's God communicating to a human being. And if God is speaking to a human being, he's obviously going to use some form of communication that we can understand. And in that case, God could materialize an audible voice for us to hear with no problem. And he said, but well, could God have been speaking to, for example, in the concept of the Trinity, right? Father, Son, Holy Spirit, they're all present at the time of creation. So, and also there's the argument to be made that the heavenly host existed at that point. In other words, angels existed at that point. So, could he have been speaking to the heavenly host? And I so and my thought was, well, nowhere does it say that the heavenly hosts were present. And while it does say it does say God said, "Let us make man in our image," to me that is not like some people argue that he's saying that to the heavenly host. But I don't think we were created in the image of angels. I think we were created in the image of God. And so the only us in that statement, I think, was the Trinity themselves. So Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I do not believe that us included the angelic host. In which case, God needing words to communicate within what we call the Trinity would require no more literal words than for us to communicate to ourselves our intention. Like if we're just contemplating something, we don't have to speak, right? We could talk to ourselves, as we say, or we could simply think about it. And yet you might say, I said to myself, even if you're just thinking about it without literally opening up your mouth and speaking with your voice. Anyway, I know that's a bit of an aside, but I do get a little frustrated with the ultra literalists out there. All right, so moving on, we're almost done with this chapter. You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals and between clean and unclean birds. Do not defile yourselves by any animal or bird or anything that moves along the ground, those that I've set apart as unclean for you. Remember, we went through all that earlier when we talked about the animals. You are to be holy, again, set apart, because I, the Lord, am holy, set apart. And have set you apart from the nations to be my own. A man or a woman who is a medium or spiritist among you must be put to death. You are to stone them, and their blood will be on their own heads. Dun, 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 right? And I'm trying to remember if this is the one that my old buddy Thunderfoot used to hate on so much. I don't remember, so I'm going back to look. And so if we switch to the King James, this one talks about a man or woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall be put to death. And I'm pretty sure somewhere it says that you are to put witches to death. Let's see. And that would be. Oh, okay, that was in Exodus 22:18. So if we look at. I'm curious about that since we're on that topic. And this is one of the things about translations. I was asked about the biblical infallibility. And I said that I do believe that some English translations of the Bible are more accurate than others. But I do believe that if you have the originals, they would indeed be truly infallible. All right, so Exodus 22:18 says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." right? So, in other words, you kill witches, right? That's the King James Version. Now, if we go to a little bit more literal translation, like the Holman, and we go back to that same verse, you must not allow a sorceress to live. And of course, I wonder what it says in the NIV, and we'll look at the actual Hebrew in a second here. Uh, Man, I suck at looking at this stuff. Okay, there it goes. And we go to verse 18. In the NIV, it says, do not allow sorcerers to live. All right, and now let's look at the Hebrew Greek. Turn that on and go back down to verse 18. Okay. All right, so the word here is kasep, or much like ketchup, that to engage in witchcraft, be a sorcerer, sorceress, engages in witchcraft, sorceress, sought omens. That's interesting. And then if we go back to Leviticus, let's go back to where we were just now, Leviticus 20, and we go back down to the bottom where that is. All right, so a medium, ob, or spiritist. So they are different words: spiritist, soothsayer, spiritist, and medium. Medium is spiritist, one who communicates, conjures, with spirit. So it is a different word, but it looks like it's some similar meaning here. I'd have to do a deeper study on the actual meanings of those words, unless one of you already has. But I think that one of the problems is we tend to, when we look at some of this stuff, we think of well, we commit the act of presentism, right? I've talked about that before, where we put our modern vernacular on an ancient text. So when it says witch, we're picturing, the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz or something to that effect, right? When the ancient Hebrew concept of what a witch was a very different thing than what we think of as a witch. Much like when and mediums and spiritists still around today. I mean, drive you I could drive down to Highway 41, 15 minutes from where I live, and I know there's one right there. Now, are they legit? Probably not, but there are people that they peddle their wares, saying they're fortune tellers and that they're going to communicate with the dead for you. Some of these people get on big talk shows and show people how incredible their insight is in communicating with the dead. And while most of these people are, complete phonies, it's still a practice that is directly condemned. And if it were real, if they actually were communing with something supernatural, chances are it's probably not, Great Aunt Gladys. It's probably, something a little more nefarious, which is a big part of the reason why it is, in fact, a forbidden practice. All right, so to the chat, we'll go for a few minutes and then going to wrap it up, and then I'm going to get me some sleep. All right, so theft back then you got hand or finger cut off, didn't it, or worse, depending on what you stole. I don't. I mean, I know in Sharia law that's still practiced today, but yeah. Oh, boy. I'm curious because I genuinely don't know off the top of my head. Um, the biblical punishments. Yeah, I didn't think so, but according to this is a I'm going to take it for what it is. This is the Google AI answering, saying the Bible prescribes various punishments for theft, emphasizing restitution and restoration, such as paying back the value of the stolen item. Remember, we did talk about this when we went through Exodus, sometimes multiple times over. If the thief couldn't pay, they were to be sold into slavery to make restitution. For serious offenses like kidnapping, the penalty was death. So no, it is not. If you steal something, and I think where that comes from, where some people get that from, is the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which again is not one of those things meant to be taken literally, because it's used as a prescription for how to weigh the value of the fine. That you are not to you that if somebody steals from you in the amount of $500, that doesn't mean that they owe you $50 million, right? It means that they owe you $500 plus there's usually like a fine involved that's a percentage of that. So if so if they steal 500, they might owe you 750 or something to that effect. But it is not to be absorbent, nor is it to be less than the value. So if somebody steals 500, the punishment is not going to be 150, right? Justice means you must do an eye for an eye, meaning you must do $500 of restitution for $500 in theft, but not severing body parts. Take two, yes, indeed, that was a mess. And then we already talked about who Moloch was. Robert says, Michael, taken. Then, so going by the law in Leviticus, anyone that ever performed or had an abortion should be put to death. That would be a lot of people. That's an interesting question because we talk about now. I don't know if I would consider abortion either child sacrifice or murder, and those would biblically be punishable by death, both child sacrifice and murder. I I'm not sold 100% on the idea that and I know some people are, and I'm not trying to sway you one way or the other. I'm just not convinced abortion is murder in the true sense. I think there's no malice involved generally in abortion. In fact, most people, both the practitioners of the abortion and most people that actually receive the procedure, are under the genuine, although in many cases misunderstood idea that what they are terminating is not a human being. And so, if you don't, so for example, is it murder? Let's say that you are bulldozing an old house that because you're going to build a new house on the site, and you did not know, but in the middle of the night, a homeless person snuck into the house and went to sleep, and so when you drove the bulldozer over the house, that homeless person ended up getting killed. Is that murder? Obviously, the answer is no. And so, if you're talking about the murder charge, I think that that's a fairly apt comparison because in many cases, the practitioners and recipients of abortion genuinely do not believe what they are doing is terminating a human being. I disagree with them, and that's a debate that needs to be had. But unfortunately, nobody's willing to have it rationally. And science, unfortunately, is something that in modern day is all agenda driven, which is sad to me. But that unfortunately we're not going to have a real conversation about it, and so many people still to this day don't believe that a fetus is a person, even though, as people like Charlie Kirk were famous for pointing out, fetus is simply Latin for offspring. So yeah, it literally means the same thing as saying your child. But then the other point, as far as child sacrifice, now you could make the argument that you are obviously you're not sacrificing your child to a god or something like that, but you are sacrificing your child for convenience, right? For the god of self, if you will. That you are sacrificing this unborn child so that you can have a better life, right? Because you're not ready to have a child, is a common argument I've heard for abortion. And okay, I can see that, except once again, you fall into the problem that these people don't believe that that's a child. And so they don't believe they're sacrificing, most don't believe they're sacrificing a child. They think that they're doing nothing more destructive than clipping your toenails, right? They really don't think that what they're doing is harming another human being. And so I don't think that trying to push the idea of abortion being murder is a productive conversation to have, because I do think genuinely that if people believed in their hearts that these are innocent human beings, that they would be much less likely to very quickly say, oh, no big deal, let's have a medical procedure to get rid of that person. And so I think the conversation should be about, can we scientifically investigate with most likely time of the beginning of human life? Now, I think the answer to that is obvious, but at the same time, many people don't, because many people are ignorant of the facts. Instead, they want to say, well, you can't detect a heartbeat until X number of weeks or whatever. And it's like, okay, but is a heartbeat the definition of life? Well, you can't determine, what they can't feel pain until a certain number of weeks. Well, a person doesn't feel pain if they are in a coma. So does that mean they're dead? Of course not. So there are, what's the difference? How do we definitively, and by the way, there are also people that are on life support that, or they have pacemakers, their heart would literally not function without artificial intervention. So are they dead? Right? How do we define it? It's a tough question. But it's a question we need to be able to have level headed conversations on rather than to ideological ones. I think Moloch maybe means the particular kind of sacrifice rather than to sacrifice any sacrifice generally. Yeah, you may be right. I tend to, you know, I would simply say this: child sacrifice bad according to Bible. All right. So, and just because God instructed Abraham to do it doesn't mean that God is pro child sacrifice, because he also did not have Abram go through with it. And so, if God thought that the sacrifice of Isaac was a good idea, he would have let Abram do it. And it seemed, at least, that Abram was under the belief that he was going to, in fact, kill Isaac, but that God was going to somehow bring him back, which God could certainly do. So, I think that Abram had faith that God was not going to not fulfill his promise, even if he obeyed God and killed him. Sunday, I didn't know you need me to answer a question. I was busy with church. It's all good. I understand. Isn't this all restating the Ten Commandments with more details? In some ways, yes, it is. And keep in mind, the Ten Commandments were in the book of Exodus. That's God just throwing down hey, here's the overview, right? We'll get to the details later, but here's the overview. Now, build the tabernacle, get things going there, and then I'll start dictating the details of the law. And that's honestly what we have here. That's the difference between Exodus and Leviticus. Is that in Exodus, God gives him, hey, here's the basics, and then, okay, let's get into the nitty gritty. Kind of like if you look at the book of Acts, where Peter and Paul come to the agreement that, hey, you know what, with these new Christians, Uh, get them to not eat strangled animals, to not drink blood, and to refrain from sexual immorality, and we'll sort out the rest over time. And so the basics for the new Christians were just those three things. Don't eat strangled animals, don't eat blood, and don't don't commit well, not just adultery, but don't commit sexual immorality. And the funny thing is, we can't even do that much because sexual immorality is so hotly contested even within the church, and it shouldn't be. It's pretty cut and dry what it is. We just don't like to face it because if we do face it head on, then in all probability, especially when we take it to the level that Jesus takes it, we are all guilty of it. And we don't want to face that. We'd rather be able to point the finger at somebody else and saying they're guilty than to come to the realization that we are guilty. And and we cannot become comfortable with being guilty. So instead, we just get into denial, and I don't think that's a healthy place to be either. What you said on Sunday made sense about my gay problem. I'm glad that it did. Anytime, look, I like deep problems, and so when people have that stuff, let's get into it. I mean, and I try to take a page from an online theologian that I happen to have respect for, even though I disagree with him from time to time, Mike Winger, which is that when you have a genuine Christian conundrum, you should try to come up with a biblical answer, meaning that rather than just kind of winging it on everything, whenever possible, we should go to Scripture to find that answer. And so I always say, please bring it, whatever you got. Hebrew didn't originally include vowels, so MLK would be Moloch without the vowels. Gotcha. Well, and I think that keep in mind, Moloch is not a Hebrew word. It's a English word that's a translation of the Hebrew word. So that's why I say Moloch, not MLK. Because I say here MLK and I think Martin Luther King. I never read 18. Yeah, you got to be careful about that stuff. And that's what you said, what if you did it was by accident? Again, you do not have sexual relations with anybody by accident. And you can't tell me. I mean, and here's the problem: if you are not, and I'm not saying this to be facetious, I'm saying this to be quite literal. If you are not suffering from a severe developmental disability, and you are even vaguely understanding of Christianity, then you know the basic tenet of sexual morality in the Bible is that sexuality is only to be expressed between a man and a woman within the confines of marriage. I think that pretty much everybody knows this. It's just that, going back, especially starting in the 60s, this became a very, very unpopular thing within pop culture. It became no longer something to be proud of, as opposed to something to be considered prudish or old fashioned. Is the idea that you would save sex for marriage? Oh my gosh, what kind of backwoods people are these, right? So we need to be I don't think that in the modern vernacular, unless you are severely developmentally delayed and or you happen to have never even heard of Christianity, which if you're in the Western world, that's not possible, then you know this. You know what the standard is. We just don't want to deal with it because we've all broken it, especially when we get into the Jesus model of it, where, Jesus makes it clear. Hey, yeah, you heard it that if you committed adultery, that, that was a sin. Guess what? If you look at a woman with lust on your heart, you've already committed adultery in your heart. And the point there is that it's not your action that is as important as your attitude. In other words, you should not be just worried about whether or not you follow the letter of the law. You should be worrying about whether you are, focused on that wanton lust for violating the law. It was dark. Yeah, it wasn't that dark. No wonder you thought we read this chapter already. Yeah, I know there's a lot of similarities to earlier. Is there any record of people being put to death for doing these things? I do not believe that. Well, we have records, well, even in the Bible, we have records of people being threatened with it at the very least. So I think it's safe to say that it did happen, but I don't think that it was in the massive numbers that some people believe. And again, like when we think of the cursing children or disobedient children and stuff like that, people are like, well, all children are disobedient. That's because you're not understanding the cultural and societal context of it, particularly when it uses words like children, or words that are translated, I should say, to children, because in the one that I just mentioned, and where it says that disobedient children will be taken outside of I don't think we've gotten to that one yet, or maybe we did. I don't remember. Got terrible memory, but it's sounding like Donald Trump. The but the if you have disobedient children, they're to be taken outside of the camp and stoned to death, right? If that was done to every kid that's ever talked back to mom and dad, then the Israelite nation would have gone extinct that generation. So obviously, it's not simply talking about every time a child talks back, you stone them to death. What it is talking about when it says that, the term child is not what we think of when we think of child. It's the same thing. Like we'll get to it. There's an interesting little story in the Bible where the prophet is being is walking along, and it says that, so depending on the translation, it'll say boys or children or something to that effect came out and insulted the prophet by calling him bald, right? And it literally says that they said, hey bald head," which I know doesn't sound like much of an insult today, but I'm sure that in the Hebrew it was like scathing. And so what happened? God sent a bear to kill the kids, right? And people are appalled by this because, hey, it was just boys being boys. It was just boys being those little pranksters are just, they're running around making fun of the funny looking bald guy, right? What's the big deal? And that's because we're looking at it again with presentism in mind. We're thinking when it says children that a bunch of 5 to 10-year-olds were doing this, maybe 10 to 12-year-olds, right? However, when you look at the actual term that's used, the more a closer translation would be something to the idea of young adult. But then when we think of young adult in the modern context, we're not even being biblically accurate, because we think of young adult as like basically minors who are almost at the age of consent, right? However, when they're from a biblical perspective, no, these are people who are adults. They're just not elderly, or they're not middle aged at this point. These are not 40-year-olds. These are like somewhere between probably the ages of 15, which keep in mind in that world was an adult, to probably around 25, right? These are not little kids running around. And chances are is that while we think, oh, well, they came out and called him a baldy, basically, but I would dare say that they were doing it in a threatening manner. And if you're walking down the street and a group of young adults comes at you, like take almost like any movie, right? You're walking down the street in the city at night, and all of a sudden, half a dozen punks in leather jackets come at you and start throwing insults. That's the stage. And so God intervened on behalf of the prophet and actually just literally took care of business by having a bear take care of it. So I think we got to be very, very careful about presentism. We do it way too often. But we also know that, like in the New Testament, the Pharisees were going to stone to death the adulterous woman. That Jesus intervened. So there's at least documented cases of attempted stonings for adultery. All right, and so having sex with a mother and daughter—that's some Jerry Springer stuff. It absolutely is, but and that's the funny thing. So back, in biblical days, it was considered capital punishment, right? In the Even in the United States, up until the 1960s, it was considered disgusting and shameful and something to be utterly embarrassed about. And then by the 1980s, it just became daytime television. If I cut my finger and hold it over my head, and blood drips from my finger onto my head, my blood will be on my own head. That is true. At the chocolate factory, you said you say verse 18, and then you said at the chocolate factory. So now I got to try and figure out what the heck you meant. Verse 18 was the one that says, "No man." Nope, that's Leviticus 21. We haven't gotten there yet. And let's turn off that. And okay. Verse 18. No man who is. Back in 21. Gosh, dang it. All right. That. All right. Verse 18. If a man has sexual relations with a woman during her monthly period, exposed to the source of her flow. Yeah. Stan, you had to go there. Interesting. The specific transgressions that are mentioned sounds like witches. We already went over the witches things, like specifically aunt, uncle, but not niece. Because think of it this way: if a niece has okay, so where was the where? Because actually that's actually a very, very easily explainable example that you gave. But I just want to make sure that I am at the right verse. Father's wife, daughter-in-law, homosexuality, marries both a woman and her mother. Uh, Man marries sister, did not sister and mother, so doesn't honor close relative. Okay, here we go. Verse 20. If a man has sexual relations with his aunt, he has dishonored his uncle. They will be held responsible and they will die childless, right? So, conversely, if you would say this, if you have sexual relations with your niece has had sexual relations with her uncle. And so you're violating the same law, right? And so you're simply looking at it from the wrong perspective. If a uncle, niece, aunt, niece have relations, it is not a capital offense, but it is a dishonorable one. And you can marry her if the brother dies. That's different. So yes, when you look at verse 21, good point. Verse 21: Man marries his brother's wife. It is an act of impurity, and he has dishonored his brother. They will be childless. That is assuming, and you're not. It's not just that the brother dies, because if your brother dies and you immediately say, "Who? I'm glad my brother died because sister-in-law is kind of hot," so you get together with her, right? And then no, that is absolutely wrong. That's the point of verse 21. Unless, and this is what it brings it up when we get to that, we'll see. If the brother died before she was had an heir, and so Because if the brother dies and there's no heir, then his family line ends. And so it is now the duty of the surviving brother to impregnate her. Not and so it's not just saying, hey, you know what, free reigns on, your dead brother's wife. So is pretending to be a witch or wizard bad? So is pretending to be a witch or wizard bad, or just those powers really bad, and they just killed most of the people who knew how it worked? Good question. I would say pretending to do it is fraudulent, and so it's still bad. It may not be as bad as actually doing it. But if you are the partaker in said services, so if you go to a medium right now and your intent is to commune with the dead, you are just as guilty whether the person that's doing it is legit or a fraud. You are just as guilty because you are still attempting to consult with spiritists. What about make wizards, warlocks, we already talked about that a bit. I meant verse 18. Yeah, I already talked about that. Oh, light, dude. And it was dark. Oh, I see what you're saying. So, what if it was unintentional as far as that? Well, that's when we get into keep in mind. Oh, that's another thing that we forget. That's why we have the sacrificial system, is to absolve people of sins. And so, some sins, like notice, there are some sins that have very specific punishments, particularly capital punishments. But sins can also be atoned for. And that's why, and it actually does talk about, the uncleanliness of the monthly cycle and the purification ritual that goes with that. So notice, it doesn't say that you're to be executed if you have sex with somebody at that time of the month. However, you would need to go through the purification. I think it just says not to marry her. It doesn't say not to have sex. Well, verse 21 does specifically say marry, but keep in mind, if you have sexual relations with someone you are unmarried to, that's either fornication or adultery, depending on your marital status. So, yeah. And yeah, get your chakra cleanse. Wrong religion, buddy. On the image of witches had held by the people of Salem. Right. Well, Salem was a long time later. And, unfortunately, there was and there still is in some sects of Christianity, an unfortunate level of superstition. Possibly neglect, homicide versus murder versus manslaughter. I forgot the legal distinctions. Well, yeah, yeah. Negligent homicide would be, that somebody died. There was no intent to kill them, but they died due to your negligence. So, like you built a factory and you didn't do good enough a job with the safety railings and somebody was leaning against the safety railing and it broke and it fell. That would be negligent homicide. Manslaughter is generally either reckless behavior or even intent to harm someone, but not necessarily intent to kill them. So you get into a fight with somebody in a bar, and during the fight, you grab a beer bottle and clank them on the head. And your attempt was to, like, you saw a bunch of movies where this happens, and the person falls down unconscious and you win the fight. But in actuality, you slice open their scalp and they bleed out on the floor, right? That would be something like first degree manslaughter generally, which first degree manslaughter and second degree murder are almost indistinguishable in some states. Remember, it varies from state to state in the United States as far as these charges, because most of these charges are state level charges. Some states have a lot of, will have 17 different degrees of murder. Some states will only have murder and manslaughter versus homicide. Some states, have are missing one or another in that list. But generally speaking, negligent homicide is unintentional harm becoming another person due to your lack of foresight, right? So, like the bulldozer situation that I talked about, that would be negligent homicide. And so, under those kinds of terms, I think that's where abortion would fall into play. Manslaughter is the intent to harm, but not necessarily the intent to kill. And murder is the intentional illegal killing of another human being. And illegal is important there because there are legal circumstances in which you can kill another human being, such as self defense or as a member of law enforcement or a member of the military that is doing it as part of their duty. All right, moving on. Let's see. I wonder why pedophilia is not mentioned since it seems worse than homosexual acts. There are, you have to understand that pedophilia is, I think that one of the problems we have here is we're not taking into account the cultural context. Pedophilia was not a issue for the Israelites generally, but the what we did have a big issue with was child sacrifice because that was going on all around them. But I do think there was something. I'm trying to remember. Let me sit her down. Uh, let's see. And okay, so let's see. Yeah, the word translated to fornication in both the Hebrew and the Greek, the Greek word is porneia, which is where we get the term pornography, which relates to any illicit sexual activity, which does include pedophilia. But the thing is that when it came to what was normalized versus these types of things is that it was pretty well established that the only way that sexual relations were okay was between a man and a woman under a God sanctioned marriage. And a God sanctioned marriage was very specifically a marriage that took place. Mary and Joseph is a great example. They might be married at a young age, like she may be prepubescent when they're married. A lot of people accuse Muhammad of being a pedophile because he was married to a girl that was very young. Now, I don't know the details as far as what it says in the Quran and all that, so I'm not going to go there. But very good possibility that Mary and Joseph were married prior to her going through puberty. However, notice that while Joseph had not had sexual relations with Mary, it does say that when he found out that she was pregnant, he was going to divorce her. Well, you can't divorce someone you're simply engaged to. You would just call it off. And so he was going to quietly divorce her so that, in order to basically prevent the public shaming of it. But the, because they were married. Okay, they were absolutely, but from our standards, they were legally married. But when we talk about the idea of consummating the marriage, it was something that was absolutely under no circumstances ever done until the woman was through puberty. For men, it wasn't really an issue because men were much, much older than the women in that culture. Typically, and again, this is one of the reasons that, by today's standards, we so creepy, but it was just the way that the world was, is that the most likely reason that we never see Joseph after Jesus at age 12 is because he was dead. Why was he dead? Because he was an old man. Because in all probability, during the Christmas event, Mary was somewhere around between 12 and 14 years old, and Joseph was probably between 30 and 40. And a lot of us think that's grotesque and terrible, But the fact is that a man would go out and establish a home, and then he would bring in a wife, and that's just how it worked. And women had to get married and start producing babies as young as possible, so they would be strong enough to have multiple children and survive. And men had to be able to provide for those children, which is why they had to already have an established career and everything prior to any of this. There was just very strict social norms to all of this. So pedophilia was never really an issue for the Israelites. But, what are ways that were issues? Well, think about prior to the Exodus, people marrying their close relatives was extraordinarily commonplace, and in fact is depicted in the Bible over and over because that was the only way you could get somebody to be your spouse who was not a part of some of these pagan groups that were despicable to God. And so the only way you could get a wife was to get to someone who was basically second cousin or closer. And so that was just the way that it was done. But then once the nation of Israel grew to the point that it did at the time of the Exodus, it's like God's like, okay, we're done with that kind of thing. Here's how we're going to moving forward. All right. Continuing on, got to try to finish up. My wife is here, and I'm ready for dinner. Let's see. Probably was not married because got married, had the kids very young. Yeah, we just kind of went over that. It was not when human life begins. The important question is, when does personhood begin? That is, well, it depends on who you talk to, because, but then you have to define what is personhood. And that's the personhood clause, if you will, is the way that most people argue because legally speaking, you are not a person. Like the United States Constitution defines a person as someone born, you know, and they'll say, like, for example, a U.S. citizen is a person born in the United States as opposed to a person born outside of the United States, which means prior to birth you are not a person, as far as the letter of the law of the Constitution. But you know what? That's a really, really, for lack of a better term, unscientific way to try to go about arguing about it. You're basically trying to argue that the laws written by a bunch of, from a modern medical technology perspective, incredibly ignorant people from a couple hundred years ago, what their, opinion was on who should be a citizen is going to define, the sanctity of human life. I don't think that that's quite what they intended, nor do I think that that is an ethical approach to it. I think that a scientific approach is to look at, to scientifically try to deduce it is going to be a little trickier because to suggest that a person is not a person until after birth, you have to give me a reason why they're not a person. And if the reason is their location, well, what if a person is located in New York as opposed to California? Does that make any difference to their personhood? Of course not. And you might say, well, they're dependent upon another person. Well, a 2-day-old baby is 100% dependent on their parents or they will die, right? So there's a million arguments that people go back and forth on these. We need to nail down what is the defining principle of personhood, if that's going to be your argument, and the defining principle can't simply be they're born, because that's just an event in your life, right? That's like saying that you're a person when you graduate high school. That's a completely arbitrary statement to say birth, because I will tell you from personal experience that children inside the womb have very distinct and separate personalities, just like they do after they're born. The argument that it's not a person or a baby until a certain point, but one could also argue humans aren't fully developed till around 25 years old, or when they, well, yeah, absolutely. And there are some Very few, but there are some people who I would say are logically consistent who will argue for infanticide for that very reason. They would say that it's perfectly okay to kill your young child because they're not fully developed. I think that's disgusting, obviously, but I think that when you are genetically complete, then you no longer have the arbitrary right to terminate. However, I would say this. One of the reasons that I call myself anti-choice. If a doctor determines that it is medically necessary for the woman to have the procedure, then you do it. That's it. About Wizards Above, I meant to type male and not make. Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, wizards are generally seen as male, where witches are generally seen as female. Trustin's taking off. Have a good one. Street Preacher saying bye to Trustin. It does say in the Old Testament that life begins at conception. It doesn't actually say that specifically. There are basically hints at how, like, God knew you when you were in the womb, or if you want to look at the New Testament, that John the Baptist leapt for joy when Mary, who was pregnant with Jesus at the time, and John was inside of Elizabeth at the time, and John was conscious of the fact that he was near the Messiah. There are definitely things like that. But does the Bible actually have a prohibition on abortion? The answer is no. Abortion is simply not mentioned. And probably in large part because, at least to the Israelites, why would you even consider it? Like, they couldn't detect things like birth defects in the womb like we can now. And the whole point of the much of the Old Testament is for the nation of Israel to survive, and the best way to survive is to multiply. So most weren't thinking, hey, let's get rid of a couple of kids. And yeah, Street Preacher, I got that now, obviously. The Constitution doesn't assign rights to humans, it assigns rights to people. Theoretically, space aliens and robots could possibly be people, but not human, and vice versa for human embryos. That's an interesting argument, but the Constitution, the whole point of the Constitution, in fact, the whole thing about the Declaration of Independence is that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. These rights do not come from the discretion of Congress. It's simply up to Congress to protect and defend these rights and to identify them. And so I think that the problem is that we don't assign rights. It's kind of like the misnomer of, what gender were you assigned at birth? You weren't. You're either male or female, except for in the very rare cases that, you have a chromosomal issue. But you are not assigned rights. The rights are the government's duty, according to the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence, is to protect the rights given by our Creator. And so I think that that's a very important distinction. However, as far as giving rights to people and a person, uh, or people being a person could theoretically be space aliens and robots, great. But I would also say a person would be an embryo. You know, so even though because really the only time nowhere does it say, and as far as I know, maybe I'm wrong. You pointed out to me, but nowhere in the Constitution does it say, by the way, you're not really a person until you're born. It simply says that to be a birthright citizen means you have to be a person born in the United States, as opposed to a person born outside of the United States. And this is one of the reasons that we have the so-called anchor baby thing, where people will come across the border while they are in labor so that they can give birth in U.S. soil, and that way their child is automatically a U.S. citizen. But that's not, I don't think that the intent of that statement is to define When someone becomes a person, it's only to define if someone is a citizen. And I think there's a difference there. I could be wrong, but that's my belief. Not just having sex. Yeah, so I got it now, Street Preacher. Maybe brain dead humans, human vegetables on life support. Well, that's the thing. A brain dead person on, okay, well, first of all, brain dead person is a little different than, say, a person in a coma. But a person in a coma cannot feel pain, has no awareness of their surroundings, and in fact has no awareness of much of anything at all, and is 100% dependent upon artificial means to keep them alive. So by almost every measurable definition, except for basically the fact that their organs are fully developed, generally, they they're in the same status as an embryo. And by the way, an embryo at a very young age can feel pain and is somewhat aware of their surroundings, etc. So only an embryo in the first few weeks. But yeah, this guy's already broken the weight for my marriage one anyway. Well, just because you broke it once doesn't give you license to break it again, and that's the thing that people don't like. Well, I've already broken that rule, so I'm not going to worry about it. No, it's not hey, it's not a pass fail thing, right? Where you once you fail, well, then you just get a fail grade on that one, and oh well. Just because you blew it before does not give you license to continue. That is, in fact, extraordinarily dangerous territory to be walking. And let's see, maybe because the idea was, of course, that's a crime. Yeah, exactly. If the chocolate factory are the rivers of milk and honey, milk and honey. Oh, so like in Willy Wonka. Gotcha. Josiah's back. I'm done at church. Excellent. Well, I'm trying to finish up. And let's see, verse 18, the sex thing. Yeah, we got that. Why isn't it against Scripture to drive 4 hours a day? Let's see. Why isn't it against Scripture to drive for hours a day on Sunday and make nothing but left hand turns the whole time? You know what? Those kinds of things, you'd have to ask a rabbi about that because to me, it makes no sense. Johnny Knoxville versus Moe from the Three Stooges. Well, I would probably have to give that one to Johnny Knoxville, if nothing else. Moe, while he has taken a lot of punishment, I think we've seen Johnny Knoxville take more. Let's see. If you're not first, then you're last. Shake and bake. Okay. Then by scripture, the Jedi are also evil for being space wizards. Also, you could make that argument. In fact, the Jedi do consort with the dead. You know, dead Jedi become one with the Force and talk to living Jedi. So, yes, you could argue that by a strict interpretation of the Old Testament, the Jedi are in fact literally space wizards. Let's see. They were just misunderstood, like those Salem Pilgrim aliens in Magics of Mages. Don't get. I'm shame on you for mentioning that episode where Kirk saves Satan. The Jedi can become a Force ghost, and other Jedi talk to him, and then it's consorting with the dead, which is another big no-no according to Scripture. Yeah, it's 100% correct. The Force is the god of Star Wars universe, or one of them, because actual magic type stuff exists in Star Wars as well. Well, the Force. I mean, if you listen to George Lucas, the Force is really because notice they even call it the Force. It's not really even called the Living Force until the prequels, which is kind of funny since Lucas wrote those. But the idea is that the Force is more like what we saw in The Last Jedi, as much as I don't like it, is that the Force is not a agent; it's it's a power field, right? Uh, it's like electricity, or it's electromagnetism. It's just it's nothing mystical about it. The Jedi make it mystical. The Sith make it mystical, but the Force itself, not mystical. Alternate version of Michael, 10 feet tall, fought dragons versus the Guardian from Samurai Jack. Only 10 feet tall versus the Guardian, I'd probably give to the Guardian. Let's see. Maybe a tricky question. Maybe personhood develops gradually during pregnancy. I don't see how you can make that case, because the problem is that you cannot when the quantity of something is zero, that's when they're not a person. Whatever that personhood quantity is, whether you want to say brain function, or you know nervous system, or optic nerve, or whatever you want to say, that's what makes a person a person. Once that quantity equals zero, then you can say that. But the problem is, and this is one of the reasons people don't want to go there, is because the quantity equaling zero almost never exists, except for like in the first few divisions of cells, in the first hours of pregnancy. So it's very early on that cells become identifiable as part of your nervous system, which includes your brain, or part of your circulatory system, or etc. Are male warlocks permitted to live while female witches are not? Not according to what we've seen looking through this stuff. Especially since warlock is used in that verse what we just read, where it says you're going to stone them to death. Our creator could just be nature and physics. I would dispute that wholeheartedly, Jeffrey, because in order for, as far as our creator, you're talking about whatever created the universe, right? Because even if you want to argue that life and eventually man is all simply the byproduct of natural phenomenon happening over time, fine, I can totally get behind that, as from a logical perspective. I can see where you might assume that. However, you're always going to run into the problem of infinite regress. No matter what type of universe you try to develop, any and every model of the universe is logically absurd without a creator. And a creator doesn't just mean some natural force, because in order for creation to have happened, it means that a first event within a temporal reality must have happened. Especially the more we understand, given relativity and everything, and the nature of time itself, we know that time had a beginning. And if time had a beginning, then whatever caused time to begin to flow must be able to act without consuming time, to which that does not exist. And despite what some people try to say with the magic of quantum physics, no, that doesn't solve your problem either. In order for the first event to happen, something needs to have caused it, and whatever that thing is needs to be able to act without the benefit of time. Now, is there, and this is one of the best arguments, I think, for theism, to be honest, is there an example within nature of anything that can act without being acted upon first? Because, I mean, even though, like, for example, Newtonian physics is a simplified version of physics. But if we compared to, it's what we call classical physics as opposed to modern physics. Modern physics being relativity and quantum mechanics generally. But if we look at Newtonian physics, one of the very basic principles of Newtonian physics is that a body at rest will remain at rest. A body in motion will remain at motion unless acted upon by an outside force. And this is not just true of being at rest or being in motion. A better way to actually express this, I think, is to say that nothing changes state without being acted upon by an outside force. So, under no circumstances does anything ever change state without being acted upon by something else. And this is where we can see a causal chain of everything that happens throughout the universe. Now, it's true that at the microscopic scale, or actually the submicroscopic, what we call the quantum scale of things, things get very, very difficult for us to understand, predict, and track. But that has to do with the problems of observing things so small. That's why we have things like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, because the way that you measure the position and velocity of a particle is by shining light on it. And depending on the wavelength of light, different light wavelengths are literally that the wave, if you will. I know that light is a particle, light is a wave, blah blah blah, but the for example, an infrared light wave is much larger physically than a ultraviolet light wave. And so the larger the light wave, then the more precisely we can measure the velocity of a particle. But because of the size of the light wave, we can't very accurately nail down its position. A tiny little light wave, something that's really, really high up there in the gamma ray kind of region of things, is so small that you can very precisely measure the position of a particle. But because you hit it with so much energy, you've changed its velocity in a unpredictable fashion. Why is it unpredictable? Because we don't have the ability to predict it. It doesn't mean that it's non-deterministic, which is what some people argue. They try to say, oh, you see, it's randomization. It's not. It's just that we can't predict what it is. And so when we get to those two extremes, we cannot measure the exact position and the exact velocity of a particle at the same time. We can pick one or the other. And actually, we can't get the exact of either. We can just, the closer we get in one, the further we are off in the other. But it's still a deterministic universe. It's just one that we can't properly observe, at least yet. But that doesn't solve the problem. The problem is that you still need something that can act without being acted upon. So is there anything in nature that we can demonstrably say can act without being acted upon? And the answer is yes, and it's actually very easy to demonstrate, and that is your mind. Some people would say your brain. I wouldn't even say your brain. It is your mind. Whatever your consciousness is, because believe it or not, despite what some biologists will tell you, we don't know exactly what consciousness is. But whatever it is, consciousness can arbitrarily act. We can, for example, do what for example, if we were purely deterministic creatures, like and in an atheistic worldview, you would have to say everything's determinism. But if we were purely deterministic creatures, then things like people doing really stupid things that they know is going to harm them would never happen. Why? Because we would simply be reacting to stimuli, and we know, if something is hot, then it will burn us, and therefore we'll never touch something so hot that it would burn us. And yet people do that all the time. They'll be like, "Ooh, I wonder if that's really. Ooh, yeah, that is hot." That would never happen, right? So in a truly deterministic worldview, you would never do things that counter what your intuitive sense would tell you to do, your instincts. But we violate our own instincts all the time. And so conscious beings, and you can argue about animals all day long, it doesn't really matter. Conscious beings with minds, seem to be the only thing in all of creation that can actually act without being acted upon. You can have a thought without something triggering that thought. All that being said, if that's truly the only thing that exists in nature that can act without being acted upon, that means that whatever caused the Big Bang must be a mind. If it's the only thing that can do that. Now, if you can demonstrate something else that can actually do that, great. But so far, the laws of physics certainly can't do that. The laws of physics are simply a description of what happened. And nature is just saying all that exists that we can observe. Well, whether we can observe it or not, something caused it. And whatever that thing is, it has to be able to act without being acted upon. That was a very long winded answer. Aren't you considered natural born American if a born American parents, even if born outside? Yes. So if both of your parents are, because I think that's in that clause as well, that if both of your parents are are American citizens, then you are automatically a citizen as well. So, yeah. And thank you so much, Arabic, for the super chat. Sorry it took me so long to get to it. And it says, thanks for the study. Take care, get some sleep. Thank you so much. The shake and bake and the other saying is from Talladega Nights. That's why I didn't get it, because I've never seen Talladega Nights. In Star Wars, I don't know if midichlorians are supposed to exist in every galaxy where life exists. They never say, because Star Wars takes place in one specific galaxy. And last but not least, Josiah says, going out with girlfriends for so long has been wanting a boy. Going out with a girlfriend for so long has gotten wanting a boyfriend who looks and acts like women and dress like one too. I'm not sure if you're talking about where your issue was, but so if you're saying that you've been going out with a girlfriend for so long that you want a boyfriend who looks and acts like a woman and dresses like one, I would say that I mean you assuming if you're going to walk the Christian walk, you already know the answer. It doesn't matter what you want. What matters in that case is where you go with that. Whether you allow yourself to indulge in those types of wants. And that's when Christ talks about lustful thinking. It's not about whether or not you have an urge for something. It's about whether or not you then start focusing on that urge rather than focusing on what you know is the truth. You just may not like that it's the truth. And with that, I bid you all adieu, and I will hopefully see you on Friday with Mr. Know-It-All. Haven't had a good streak lately.